All right. Good evening, everybody, and happy Hanukkah. Happy eighth night of Hanukkah. Thank you for joining us on this last evening of the holiday for what I expect is going to be a really fascinating discussion on the history of Hanukkah music. My name is Ben Harris. I'm the managing editor of My Jewish Learning, and I am really excited to be moderating this panel with four really interesting experts on Jewish music. I will introduce them, I think, as they go. And I also want to encourage folks, if you have questions or comments, the chat is open. So please do share with us your questions and your comments, and we will do our best to leave a little bit of room at the end so our panelists can respond. We are going to begin this evening with Albert Stern. Albert Stern is the editor of the Berkshire Jewish Voice, not too far from where I live here in Western Massachusetts. And Albert is a expert of sorts on the history of I Have a Little Dreidel. And in fact, has written journalism about it and is going to share with us to start us off tonight a little bit about that song. Albert, thank you for being with us.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. So I am the one person on the panel who is really not an expert on Jewish music, but in the year 2015 and around November, I got a call from an author. Sadly, he's passed away. His name's Scott Christensen, and I'm the editor of the Berkshire Jewish Voice, which is the Jewish newspaper in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. And Scott proposed a story to me about his father-in-law. He said his father-in-law was 95 years old. His name was Myron Gordon. And he was the son of, or he is the son of Samuel Goldfarb, who was one of the co-writers of the song, I Have a Little Dreidel. And he just recently sponsored the creation of an album to celebrate his father's music. And would I be interested in doing a story on it? You know, it was November. I'd wrapped up my Hanukkah issue. And I said, well, I'm done with my Hanukkah issue. He goes, well, there's actually more to the story. Samuel Goldfarb, he said, was the brother of Israel Goldfarb. And Israel Goldfarb was the person who wrote the melody to Shalom Aleichem. It's the one that we all know. And the two brothers they were very different kinds of people. Samuel was more interested in the modern composition, and Israel was more interested in the traditional music. And would you like to do a story about that? And I thought that was very interesting to have one brother who wrote I Have a Little Dreidel, and the other one who wrote this Shalom Aleichem. And I thought that if you put it in Christian terms, the equivalent would be with somebody who wrote Jingle Bell Rock, one brother, and the other brother who wrote Silent Night. So I said, okay. So I started talking to Myron Gordon, and he told me the story about his family. And the Goldfarbs came to America from Poland. Israel was about 14 years older than Samuel, and Samuel was born in the United States. And Sam was, as he grew up, he was entered into an arranged marriage with a woman named Bella Horowitz, who was actually from the family from Horowitz, Marguerite, and Matzes. But it was an unhappy marriage. And Samuel was involved in a lot of he was playing in theaters, and he is playing vaudeville, and he was more interested in modern music. Israel, on the other hand, went to the Juilliard School. He was the first professor of Nusach at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He went to Columbia University. And in 1918, he wrote the melody for Shalom Aleichem, which spread around the world. Everyone thought that Shalom Aleichem was kind of a traditional Hasidic melody, but it wasn't. And how did it get disseminated? It got disseminated in a book called The Jewish Songster that was put together in the 1920s, and was a compendium of Jewish music that the Goldfarbs wrote and also that they collected. Shalom Aleichem was part of that compendium, and so was I Have a Little Dreidel. I Have a Little Dreidel was part of the outreach done by the Jewish Jewish Education Society, and it was part of an effort to Americanize Jewish practice and Jewish song, try to bring in children who might have otherwise rejected Judaism, make something more American about it. And in the 1920s, he wrote "I Have a Little Dreidel." He wrote songs about all the different holidays. There was one recording of it in 1927, and it took a little time for it to catch on. It didn't catch on until the 1950s. Now, for Myron Gordon, who was 95 when he collected different Jewish musicians like Neshama Carlbach, Theodore Bickel, to create this record called that he produced by to honor his family. But the problem is, and I hate to bring people down here on the last night of Hanukkah, the Have a Little Dreidel has kind of a dark story. Number one, that Samuel Goldfarb abandoned his family in 1929 and left his Myron and his mother and moved to Seattle to become the director of music there, to get as far away from New York as possible. And Samuel rejected his son for the rest of his life. He only saw him a couple of other times. Myron saw him when he was in the army and he was in his uniform, and Samuel didn't even acknowledge him as his son. He called him his friend. So Myron changed his name from Goldfarb to Gordon. He became a clinical psychologist. He also had real problems with his family, and only when he was 95 years old that he decided to create this record. And you can still obtain it at the website. I'll put it in the chat room, JewishAmericanSongster.com. And he tells his story very well about his father. And unfortunately, too, the other author of I Have a Little Dreidel was a guy named Samuel Grossman. And a couple of years after the song came out, he fell into a deep depression and actually committed suicide. He jumped out the window of the Statler Hotel in Philadelphia. So it has a dark, kind of a darkness about it. But what's interesting about the song is that there was no, let's say, hit version of it. Nothing that came out in the night. It only started to gain currency in the 1950s when it started to become a popular children's song, and pretty much through the Jewish Songster. The Jewish Songster was a very important document in Jewish American music history, because as Jews left New York to go to different places, different parts of the country, they took the songster with them and used that as part of their liturgy. So that's kind of how Shalom Aleichem became a popular song. It's also, as I Have a Little Dreidel, became a popular song. From my newspaper, I did write the story. It wasn't a Hanukkah story. I published it in January, and I went to JTA and I said, "Hey, here's a pretty good story about I Have a Little Dreidel." I said, "It's a Hanukkah story." And I said, "No, there's other things. It's a Hanukkah story. Come back in a year," which I did. JTA, after a year, picked it up, and it became the most popular Hanukkah story around the world that didn't have a latke recipe in it. That year, it was translated into Polish, into Hebrew, into Russian, and it's just a nice story. Myron felt very, he's about 100 now. He felt very gratified that it was no longer associated with his childhood pain, that he could overcome it by creating this record. So that's the story of I Have a Little Dreidel.
Thanks, Albert. Thank you for
Sure.
sharing that with us. I didn't know any of that.
Yeah, no problem.
We're going to move next to Tina Frühauf. I hope I got that correct or close to correct. Tina is an adjunct associate professor at Columbia in New York who focuses on Jewish music in modernity. Her current work focuses on the historiography of music scholarship and migration, the mass dislocation of peoples in the 20th century, conditions of globalization, genocide, exile, and minority experience. Lots of fun stuff. Thanks for being with us, Tina.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. A happy Hanukkah to everybody. To set the mood for our time together this evening, allow me to start with a piece of music led by the inimitable Theodor Bickel.
Maoz Tzur Yeshuati Bechana Eleshabeya Tikon Betefilati B'Sham Torah Nezabeya Le'etachim Marbeya Mitzvah
According to the Talmud, the main song for Hanukkah should be Psalm 30. But for many, the medieval Ashkenazi hymn, Maoz Tzur, which we just heard, is the most important musical feature of the feast. It was originally sung only in the home, but has been used in the synagogue since the 19th century or even earlier. We now sing it each night when igniting the candles or oil as part of the key ritual of Hanukkah. Countless tunes have been written for this 13th century poem. In the Venetian ghetto, the Ashkenazi Jews sang it to a different tune, captured and published by Benedetto Marcello as a suggested melody for the words of Psalm 16 in his Estro Poetico Armonico. There is a Hasidic version from Lithuania that strings together several motifs. There are Moroccan and Bukharian renditions, as well as several modern melodies. The most widespread and universal tune, however, which greats such as Theodor Bickel have internalized, is the bright and stirring melody that originated in Germany. It has become so popular that it serves as the representative theme in musical references to the feast, as do Adehu for Passover and Akdamut for Sukkot. Other Hebrew hymns for the occasion are also being sung to it. But what actually are its roots? Among early Jewish music historiographers, there has been disagreement which source informed our Maoz Tzur melody. Cantor Eduard Birnbaum of Königsberg wrote in 1889 that the tune was taken from a folk song. Arno Nadel wrote in 1937 that he disagreed with the Birnbaum analysis on the grounds that the folk tune appears in triple meter and has a melody which diverges too much from the Maoz Tzur now sung. Abraham Idelson claimed that Maoz Tzur stems partly from a German march dating from the early 16th century. Up to the current day, there are myths about the melody and its semblances to other tunes. Thus, a klezmer musician voiced that the tune derived from a piece by Joseph Haydn and claimed that this was a well-known fact. In reality, the melody strongly resembles the old medieval German folk song notated in Franz Böhme's Old German Songbook and known in English as "So Now I Know One Thing That Gives Me Joy, a Flower on the White Heath." The tune might have been already widespread among German Jews as early as 1450, when we have first testimony that Maoz Tzur was sung, though we cannot know for sure to which melody. As first observed by Birnbaum, Martin Luther used this German folk song for his Protestant chorale, known in English as Dear Christians, One and All Rejoice. And the semblance to Maoz Tzur is striking indeed. I play a little excerpt from the Martin Luther chorale in the original German. The earliest notation attesting to the use of this melody for Maoz Tzur can be found in the 1744 manuscript of Judah Elias of Hanover. The earliest printed transcription of the tune in a Jewish context can be found in a setting of George Gordon Byron's poem on Jordan's Banks by the Anglo-Australian composer Isaac Nathan. It then appears in Abraham Bear's 1877 ballad Fila, and indeed from the late 19th century onward, the melody has been included in countless anthologies, but in two versions. Julian Lazarus Mombach, a German-born synagogue composer who held the position of musical director of the Great Synagogue of London, had introduced a modified version in his adaptation for four voices. It features a slight change in melodic contour, along with a bridge passage at the end of the repetition of the first phrase. And the closing phrase of each verse is not sung a second time. The other version, and that is the one that we heard sung by Bikel or led by Bikel, repeats the first phrase exactly and the last phrase with a small change. This is the version that Bikel chose for his recording A Taste of Hanukkah. Donning his self-taught guitar accompaniment, he leads a large chorus in unison, accompanied by an orchestra that includes festive brass instruments. It is noteworthy that he only sings the first verse, initially in Hebrew and then again in English, Rock of Ages, let our song praise thy saving power. The bilingual rendition allows audiences on all levels of observance to understand the text and to participate. It is this standard Western European Ashkenazic melody that has prevailed in many places around the world. It is testimony to Jews and non-Jews living side by side for centuries, interacting with each other and sharing the same tunes. It is testimony to a common belief in the power of music and its universal expression and appeal. As a tune that carries sentiments such as strength of character and steadfastness, it can be enjoyed by anyone. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you, Tina. Appreciate that so much. Next up, my old friend, Samuel Torjman Thomas. Sam is a multi-instrumentalist. He's a vocalist. He's the founder and artistic director of Asefa and the New York Andalus Ensemble. He is also a teacher of ethnomusicology and Sephardic Jewish Studies at City University of New York and a faculty member of both the Aleph and Academy of Jewish Religion cantorial programs. And finally, he is the director of musical arts at the Sephardic Community Center. Welcome, Sam. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. What a great affair this is to talk about Hanukkah and all of its melodies and musical routes and roots, which of course is the crux of, I think, the regeneration of the idea of Jewish diaspora. Hanukkah and the songs that we find in the musical cultures of the Sephardic and Mizrahi communities definitely speak to that very regeneration. Just to pick up from where Tina left off there, Maoz Tzur certainly has circulated widely, like many other things in the Jewish diaspora, as a text, and more recently the melody itself finding its way into communities that might otherwise not have had as much familiarity with it until more recent times or recent decades. So just on that note, I mean, I can share on a personal note that the melody is prominent within the liturgical practices of the Moroccan Jewish communities and also in the Syrian community. In fact, one of the touchstone books of Pizmonim for the Syrian community, the Red Book, as it's known, has several Pizmonim or texts for Hanukkah songs, and Maoz Tzur is in there, of course, and it attributes the lahin, or the melody, to Ajam, to being this melody, which is Ajam Makam Ajam is kind of a major sounding melodic mode. So there's definitely a lot to say about the hegemony of that particular melody from Maoz Tzur around the Jewish world. I do think that we find Hanukkah in the modern period to be a source of inspiration and innovation in terms of music making. There's been a lot of material added in a more recent time around Hanukkah. And so to talk about the Sephardi Mizrahi community more broadly, we certainly want to think about that which is in the Mediterranean world. We also think about the presence and prevalence of Ladino song, and we also think about the prominent role that Sephardi Mizrahi communities play in Israel, in the modern state of Israel. And all of these realms show us a lot of modern repertoire coming about from or in relation to Hanukkah. So in Israel, for instance, so many of the songs that we know, including the most famous, perhaps Mia Malel, is really a relatively modern piece that is centered around some of the foundings of the state of Israel and the idea of Hanukkah as a touchstone holiday for modern Zionists, and therefore operating from the secular realm as well as into the religious side of the spectrum. And so we have a lot of stuff coming out in Israel, and more modern renditions of songs, even including this German melody of Maoz, or even Mia Malel, which now have had an imbuing of a Mizrahi sound to it, along with the growth of the popular Musika Mizrahit sound in Israeli pop music in recent decades. So I'm going to play first and foremost just a fun version of Mia Malel that was released just recently on a video here. Let me just cue this up here real quick. And we can hear a little bit of that Mizrahiyut kind of trappings added to this modern piece. I'm just going to, well, I think this one will be worth sharing the video. So let's do that.
3, 4. מי ימלל גבורות ישראל אותן מי ימנה, הן בכל דור יקום הגיבור גואל העם. מי ימלל גבורות ישראל אותן מי ימנה, הן בכל דור יקום הגיבור גואל העם. שמע
just a taste there of how a more recent piece has been given a Sephardi Mizrahi kind of treatment. We can also hear new melodies from Maoz Tzur, certainly, but I want to actually focus a little bit on a historical text called Yahatzel Yona Mechaka, which we find from the Bavli community. Now, we don't know the provenance of the actual text, but we do know that the melody, the text was really brought into more modern times with a melody by a 20th century composer Rahamim Amar, who was part of the Syrian or Yerushalmi tradition. Let me play a little bit of that one for you. And I'd like to share the piyut as well. So let's see. Actually, I think I will just share the audio. And the piyut just says, Yahatzel Yona Mechaka v'dim'ata lach mefaka. And this is really a key element, I think, that we find in a lot of the Sephardi piyutim, this notion of focusing on not the modern Israeli sense of the heroes and the strength, the military victory that Hanukkah represents, but rather the notion of the Geulah and the redemption, and that Hanukkah, which we find embedded in the Maoz Tzur text, is really focused on as another opportunity for Geulah or redemption to occur. And so in this particular line, Yahatzel Yona Mechaka, we are hearing that God is the shadow of the dove in waiting, and v'dim'ata lach mefaka, that through our tears we will spark the revolution of Geulah, which is, of course, a direct connection to Pesach, where the Geulah was sparked by the tears. The crying of Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim is what finally got Hashem to make the move. So this is Yahatzel Yona, and I love this rendition because this is actually some young guys who've recorded this in Israel recently. Oh, I do not need to share the view of that. Sorry, that is just the player. Give me 1 second here. Yahatzel Mechaka. So that is a more recent melody, but the only melody that we know, actually I take that back, there's a Sikha melody as well in Makam Sikha for that particular piyut, but that is a very well-known melody in the community. Along the lines of this continued production and modernity, we have the great Paitan of Morocco, Rabbi David Buzaglo, best known for really being the carrier of a tradition for bakashot and passing this on to a number of chazanim before their immigration to Israel in the mid-20th century. He himself immigrates to Israel in the 60s and writes this piyut for Hanukkah, because Hanukkah, of course, has this larger place now in the imagination of the community in the modern period. So he writes this piyut called Am Ne'emanai, Zera Emunai, Hodu Lashem Ki Gavar Hasto, meaning that the people of faith are the seeds or the roots of the of faith itself, and Hodu Lashem, thanks to God, the greatness of God's kindness. And then the first verse, B'yamei Matityahu Zaken Yedidya, in the days of Matityahu, of course, the elder, and there we go. We're going to start talking about elements and themes of Hanukkah and connecting things even to Torah because of Matityahu being considered part of the line of the Kohanim, and how Hanukkah then connects to the return of this priestly status. So Am Ne'emanai, now interestingly, melodically, it's in Makam Hijaz, a pretty well-known Yerushalmi tune, but it has been Moroccanized. And what I mean by that is that there is a Hijaz in the Yerushalmi world that is very similar to the Hijaz in the North African world, save for a quarter tone, which is not present in the Moroccan version, but is present in the Yerushalmi version. This melody is actually used for Psalm 113, which is also part of Hallel, which we see every day in Hanukkah. And so it has been transferred now as the setting for this modern piyut and altered a little bit to fit the Moroccan sound. So on this one, I think I'm going to just perform it live. Finally, we now turn to what I was mentioning before about Ladino, and certainly there's a lot of new production in Ladino, and very importantly, of course, Ladino's history of music really rests a lot in the hands of female progenitors in Jewish society who are sharing the language in the home and passing it through the generations. Much new material has been written in Ladino, including Judy Frankel's songs of Hanukkah. So here's a taste of that. This is, and many different repertoires in Ladino. There's repertoires for Purim and so forth, but this is part of the modern compositions in Ladino.
Mors viene la fiesta de la Hanukkah, a todos mozos hinche de alegría, la mujer nunca manca de ir su tarea, porque ya encombe Hanukkah. siempre Deus nos acordaremos y a Dios grande siempre bendizeremos.
Finally, I want to take one more very modern rendition, and so I guess the story of the Sephardic Mizrahi contributions, while there are historical texts, so much production in the Sephardi Mizrahi world includes a lot of new things happening. And I would say that about Hanukkah repertoire in general. Let me just share this one video, which was just dropped, to use a modern term, by my friend Sarah Este, who just published an entire Hanukkah album in Ladino, including with songs written by many others and herself. This is a new video that was just released with Ochos Candelicas, which is again a modern song in Ladino. And I'll just play a touch.
Ay, ocho candelas. Hanukkah linda está aquí, ocho candelas para mí. Hanukkah linda está aquí, ocho candelas para mí. Ay, ay, ay. Y una candelita, lele, dos candelitas, lele, tres candelitas, lele. Cuatro candelitas, cinco candelitas, seis candelitas, siete candelitas, ocho candelas para mí.
Lots of fun. I would say, just in wrapping on that, you know, the melody here is a little bit different than what some people might be familiar with Otros Candelicas, although it does come in a hint of it at the very end of this. But the setting, which includes Yehuda Shweki in Israeli, is obviously making some diasporic connections back to a soundscape imaginative of a historical Jewish presence in Spain through the flamenco sound, which of course postdates the Jewish presence in Spain. So very complex realms and circuits and routes and routes that we are seeing. And I believe that the history of Sephardi Mizrahi Hanukkah contributions definitely supports that idea.
Thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate that so much. I think I'm not the only one who just had my palette of what I think of as Hanukkah music dramatically expanded. So thank you for that. I want to remind people before we go to our last presenter that we're going to try to leave a couple minutes at the end for questions. So if anybody has anything they want to ask to anyone who presented, please do drop that in the chat. Should have a couple minutes at the end that we can put those forth to the panel. Our final presenter this evening is Mark Kligman. He is the chair of Jewish music at Albert School of Music. He's also a professor of ethnomusicology and musicology, specializing in liturgical traditions of Middle Eastern Jewish communities and popular Jewish music. He is also the director of the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience. Welcome, Professor Kligman.
Thank you very much, Ben. Just one quick clarification. I hold an endowed chair of Jewish music. There's no chair to have of a department, so I hold an endowed chair of Jewish music. It's really great to be here. Happy Hanukkah to everyone. It's nice to be with my fellow colleagues, Tina Frühauf and with Sam Thomas, and great to hear the words of Albert. And my task was to try and provide a broader context to the history of Jewish music. And as you'll see, I'll follow up on a lot of the things that you already heard Sam really talk about. So as a very joyous holiday, Hanukkah's music is all about joy and celebration. And it's so important to remember what Sam said, that Hanukkah is musically is a very modern phenomenon. It's not like the high holidays where there are particular synagogue melodies where there's particular rituals to follow. Hanukkah is very different than the high holidays. There are no real specific melodies for Hanukkah other than the Maoz Tzur. I'll return to that in 1 minute. But Hanukkah is primarily a holiday celebrated at home. Most Jewish holidays, of course, are celebrated at home. Many important things happen in the synagogue. But Hanukkah is all about lighting candles at home, Persum Hanes, publicizing the miracle of Hanukkah through lighting the Hanukkah candles. So there are particular blessings associated with it. And also, as Tina said, Psalm 30, as well as the recitation of Hallel. Other than that, there are no specific requirements of Hanukkah. So it's not like other parts of Jewish liturgy, which might have a certain tie to tradition. Hanukkah has that ability to really transform and to really become new. Maoz Tzur, which melody in the history we heard from Tina, is very important in the Ashkenazic community's history because it's not only used as a tune for the piyut or the poetry of Maoz Tzur, but sometimes it's also used in the synagogue. It could be used for Lecha Dodi. It could be used for Micha Mocha. It becomes this reoccurring motif, but it's the only motif that we have in the Jewish tradition that comes from Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is really, as I said, really, really renewed. So there are no other specific practices, but there's one historic point that I would just want to touch on very quickly. When George Friedrich Handel wrote Judas Maccabeus in 1746, in his lifetime, it was the second most sung oratorio. Of course, the Messiah was the oratorio performed the most in his lifetime, but Judas Maccabeus was the second most popular oratorio performed, and it was fully embraced by the Jewish community and had a very special relationship with the Jewish community in England. And there's a song from that oratorio called See the Conquering Hero Comes, and that melody is used very often and was actually used as theme music for the first Maccabiah games in Israel. So of course we have various venerable tunes that have come and developed, but these tunes are very modern in our American tradition that have developed here in America, or they've come from Israel. As Albert described, with the very interesting history of I Had a Little Dreidel, other songs like Sivivon, Sov Sov Sov, Al Hanisim, these are all melodies that are brought to America through Israel, and this has a very similar history to Pesach melodies. Many of the Pesach melodies that we sing at home also have a similar history. Most of them are pretty new. There are very few that are considered to be old. And many of those are melodies that are created here in America and also come from Israel. So I want to end this by talking about how Hanukkah is truly an open canvas for creativity. As Sam said, it's a regeneration. And that regeneration, as we heard in the Sephardic tradition and the wonderful set list that Sam had, and it'd be great maybe if we can post it so everyone can learn these many new melodies. But prior generations have sort of focused on the fact that there's another holiday around this time of year that a lot of Jewish composers wrote melodies for that became very popular. And everyone says, where are the Jewish melodies? Well, the truth is the Jewish melodies are here. We just have to sing them. We just have to distribute them. We just have to give these new melodies a chance. It was fascinating to me 11 years ago when the Maccabees, this group from Yeshiva University in New York, put out their candlelight video. It had tens of thousands and surged to hundreds of thousands of hits in that particular year that it came out in 2010. Today, it has 16 million hits. You know, 16 million, there aren't 16 million Jews in the United States. The fact that it has 16 million hits tells you that there's a hunger for new melodies, and melodies are getting out there. So this is the opportunity for creativity, for people to create new melodies, for composers to compose new tunes, for songwriters to write new songs. And we all have to be willing to give these new tunes a chance so that we can create a new tradition. And that is ultimately what Hanukkah is all about. Hag Sameach.
Thank you so much, Professor Kligman. Again, friends, we have just a little under 15 minutes left in our hour together. If there are some questions that anyone wants to put to the panel, please do share them with us via the chat. We did have one question come in for you, Sam. We had someone who was unfamiliar with the oud and was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that instrument that you played.
Sure. Not so related to Hanukkah per se, but happy to share the oud. This is one of my ouds. It has 11 strings, 6 courses that are doubled and 1 that is single, and they're just doubled for volume. Shaped, of course, like a lute, because al-oud in Arabic becomes a lute in Europe, and frets are added and different tunings are experimented with. So the oud does not have frets, and it's a very central instrument throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And the fretlessness of it allows for, of course, slidings and things like that. And also, more importantly, to the east, being able to play actually quarter tones in the makam system. So that's a little bit of a primer on the oud.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. One thing I wanted to ask folks is about the context in which some of these songs are sung on the holiday. I think many of us are familiar with Maoz Tzur being the song which is sung traditionally once the candles are lit. But with these other melodies that have been mentioned, and many of them being much more modern, is there any standard context in which they are sung on the holiday? Or are they just things that we watch on YouTube? Like, have any of them made their way into any sort of ritualized performance? That's an open one anyone can grab. Go ahead, Mark.
So that it really raises a great question, Ben, because we've changed the context in which we find music because of our, mobile automated world of, our phones and computers, where music, we would say 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago was really made by us, or made, at home. People would stand around a piano and sing music in general, and sheet music was very popular. So people making music is kind of where it really comes from. And so much what we talked about with Maoz Tzur, and I had a Little Dreidel, really falls into that category of us really making the music. As it becomes recorded and disseminated, and that we have videos, I would say the context changes. And it changes in such an interesting way, because it's, I think, just wonderful before every Jewish holiday, where different groups like Maccabees, 613, I mean, there's so many groups, can't mention them all. It's like a rush to see who's gonna own the holiday through the music. Is it gonna be the Fountainheads? Who's it gonna be that's really gonna put out that viral video? I think a lot of one strong representation of a lot of the music today is really what's done in schools. And I think in the classroom and assemblies, a lot of this music, like Ocho Candelitas and many of these new tunes, are heard in that context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would like to piggyback on that too, because first of all, that is absolutely astute and on point, especially as we talk about so much being newly created. The synagogue, to the question of the liturgical context, definitely operates in the Sephardic and Mizrahi world as a bit of a canvas for expressing connections to the calendrial cycle. And so, as I alluded to before, with even the incorporation of the Maoz Tzur melody, there are these other melodies that do find their way into liturgical expression, particularly because in a lot of the Sephardic contexts, there's a openness to contrafacta. So, I mean, the Maoz Tzur melody, I heard it personally in shul like 3 or 4 times yesterday, because it was the touchstone for the holiday, and it was being used for Kiddusha, it was being used for Hallel, it was being used for El Adon. So, you know, it was being incorporated in many different ways. And similarly, the melody that I played earlier, the Hatzel in Ajam, would also find its way in the Syrian synagogue as part of the liturgical practice. So I haven't quite heard Ochos Candelicas brought in that way, but I've certainly heard some other Ladino pieces. And I think it would be hard to perform the Maccabees versions inside liturgical contexts. But that is one way that I think we're finding some of the Hanukkah repertoire. Mia Malel, definitely, you know, so many of those kinds of tunes.
Tina, you were nodding along. Did you want to jump in there too?
Well, you know, if we think about this historically, then we can actually see that the position of music during Hanukkah has been one from participation to more consummation. And I think that if we kind of see this trajectory from this one pillar to the other, then it kind of conceptually perhaps wraps up what my colleagues have been filling with content. And that's certainly due to the advent of the sound recording first, and then followed by music videos later. And, you know, I think we are now at an interesting point, because the music of participation and music of consummation are coexisting, of course. It's not just one or the other, but this kind of consummation, I think did not exist pre-recording, and I think that's an important aspect to be aware of.
Thank you. There was a question about just the songs that you had played, Sam, and I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that you had posted some links in the chat. So for whomever was asking that question or whoever else is interested, those links are available in the chat. And speaking of participation, we also had a question about recommendations for places to get public domain sheet music for Jewish music. And if there is anything along those lines, I guess the easiest thing to do is also to pop that in the chat. I'll ask another question since they're not they're not rolling in super fast. I was very surprised to learn of the non-Jewish origins of the Maoz Tzur melody, and I think once I heard it, it struck me as so, I never noticed it before, but so different in quality from what I think of, at least in the Ashkenazi context, as liturgical music and holiday music as being much more somber in a minor key, and this one has these like big major key leaps. And I'm just wondering if there are other examples of that, of melodies that have come into the Jewish consciousness by way of non-Jewish sources like that.
You know, they are, but I want to trace back. I didn't want to claim that they are non-Jewish origins. I wanted to claim that there are similarities. In the end, these kind of similarities are a little bit like chicken and the egg. You don't know really what comes first. And there is no hard proof, no empirical proof that actually one preceded the other. And so we can only really make comments on the similarities and what these similarities mean, and that's, I think, quite important to be aware of, that, you know, we should kind of be careful from making assumptions from that. There are others, but I cannot think of any other at this current moment. But there are sources on that. There's a scholar, Eric Werner, who has actually looked at similarities between the Christian context and the Jewish context, and it can be all looked up. And it's about really co-territorial musical practices that have been existing for centuries.
Mark, did you want to jump in?
Sure. So, I mean, other salient examples, like from Passover, would be like Adir Hu, has a very similar history to Maoz Tzur, where there are, you know, sort of, traces of folk melodies in Germany, you know, around that period of time. But, you know, the term that we're using today as scholars of co-territoriality is really to express the fact that, you know, for a long time, Jewish music has really been viewed as, like, as people have explained it before, like the Noch Schlepperde music. You know, somehow Jewish music isn't as good as other kinds of music, and other kinds of music have originality. Jewish music doesn't have that. And so we're reframing a lot of those questions. We're really reframing how we look at those things to really say that a lot of these traditions really are happening and developing at the same time. And all music is based upon its environment and its context, the way that jazz and blues and R&B and other things have developed in America is all about borrowing and about the mixing of different musical traditions. In the Mizrahi context that Sam talks about, the entirety of a lot of those repertoires of Sephardi Mizrahi music is contrafact, is music that really comes from other places. And there's such a beautiful idea that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the former chief Sephardic rabbi, says about this, that where it says in the Talmud and Megillah that you can't take vessels or kalim that are used for idolatrous practices or avodah zorah, because somehow physically they become impure because they've been used in an impure Jewish context. But he says about melodies, he uses the Hebrew words lo lehishtamesh ba. It's not a physical entity. That the beauty of music is that it's recreated every time it's done. Mm-hmm. So the intention of who's singing that melody and what they want it to be is as important as anything to the origins of the music, and kind of goes back, to your first question about how important context is.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. That's a beautiful pasuk, by the way, Mark. I'm going to follow up with you on that one. But Rambam also writes, when he's asked in one of his responsa about the melodies coming from the cafes and so forth in his time, and he has problems with the context, but not when they're recontextualized, because of that kind of idea. And I think we find that a lot in Hasidic Nigunim practices as well. To kind of speak to that back and forth too, in Morocco, the Moroccan context, so much of the music that is being brought into the synagogue, so to speak, is something that was also being created outside of the synagogue with Jewish participation. So it's kind of coexisting in two different contexts, and perhaps the idea of bringing it in is not exactly right, because in some ways it was brought out too, because these performers and these composers were participating in the non-Jewish contexts very integrally. So it's hard to, I think, truly trace, or even maybe it's a fool's errand. I like the chicken and egg analogy there that Tina presented.
Thank you, Sam. We have 1 minute to go, and I think it's perfect to end with this very urgent question that Libby has put in the chat. Given that we've learned so much tonight about all the great Jewish music for Hanukkah, why do radio stations still only play Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song? Does one person want to grab that for 1 minute and offer a thought on why that is before we say goodbye? No takers. Albert, you want that one?
When I think I have a Little Dreidel, it's a song that's easy to sing along with. And when I hear some of the Maccabees songs, they're very clever and they're very complex. I don't know if that's something that someone can recreate in their home very easily. It's not simple and catchy. So the Adam Sandler song is pretty simple and it's pretty catchy. So maybe that has something to do with it. And it's also humorous in a way that I think a wider audience would understand it. Whereas the Maccabees and the 613, I mean, it's definitely just for a Jewish audience. So that would be my stab at answering that question.
Great. And I would just add, please tell your friend Veronica it is time to celebrate Hanukkah.
Okay.
Friends, thank you so much for joining us tonight, everybody. It's been really fun. I want to thank Sam and Albert and Tina and Mark for their time and their expertise and all the stuff that we have all learned. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Please enjoy the last night of the holiday. Chag Sameach, and a good night to you all. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.